Welcome to another episode of NBM Talks, a series of the Narrative-Based Medicine Lab, where we speak with individuals who are working at the intersection of literature, medicine, and health. Our guests are writers, clinicians, scholars, artists, and advocates who are pushing the boundaries of what's possible in the field. Together we discuss how we can engage with narrative-based medicine principles and practices in creative and diverse ways. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome, everyone, to our recording of NBM Talks. I'm Sarah Kim, the Health Humanities theme lead for Temerity Medicine. And today we have Sayantani DasGupta with us as our guest. I'm just going to read a short bio by Sayantani, but we'll dive into hearing more from her. Sayantani DasGupta is a pediatrician by training, co-founder and faculty in the master's program in narrative medicine at Columbia University, where she also teaches in the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. She is, in addition, a New York Times best-selling novelist of more than a dozen books for young people, and her Bengali folktale and string theory-inspired middle-grade fantasy novel, The Serpent's Secret, was a Bank Street Beck's Book of the Year, a book list best middle-grade novel of the 21st century, and an E.B. White Read Aloud Honor Book. She was a longtime member of We Need Diverse Books and is a founding member of Authors Against Book Bans. She is best known for her thinking on her narrative humility and abolition medicine, and continues to speak and write on issues of race, speculation, justice, and health. So welcome, Sayantani. It's so great to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
I think our listeners often like starting by hearing a bit from you about how you have arrived to the work that you do currently. And you can go in any direction with this story, because that's really what this talk is about. And I invite you, yes, just to let our listeners know.
Well, thank you so much. I grew up in an immigrant activist household. My parents are post 1965 immigrants to the US. And I state that date specifically because those of us who are Asian Americans know that 1965 was a marker when the immigration laws really changed and allowed many of our parents, or many of us, to immigrate. And it was mostly due to the hard work and perseverance of mostly African American civil rights activists in this country. And I, was the daughter of post 1965 Indian immigrants. My mother was the founder of one of the first, or the first rather, anti-domestic violence organization in this country aimed at South Asian Americans, Manavi. And that was really my childhood context of growing up, was political activism. This organization founded in my kitchen. My father drew the logo. I would stuff envelopes and be involved in fundraising activities as a young person. So this really was, my political orientation growing up. I did not have doctors in my immediate family. And so when I applied to medical school after a pretty politically involved undergraduate career, I was really looking at it as a tool for social justice work. I didn't really have practical touch points of people who said, well, yes, ideally, it's a wonderful tool of social justice work, but here are some of the hurdles you might be facing. So I, went to medical school really unaware of the long histories of racism or eugenics or other medical violences that have been baked really into U.S. medicine as well as U.S. medical education. I have always been a writer. And so over my time in medical school, I ended up writing, and some of them were published, some of them were not, a series of essays about my experience of medical education. That eventually became my first book, a memoir called Her Own Medicine, published many, many years ago now, out of print. Uh, but that was the beginning of my recognizing that my work would kind of be at the intersection of the stethoscope and the pen. That first experience where I began writing about, what medical training was like, from the perspective of a trainee. Now, fast forward a number of years later, I, as a fellow, kind of post my pediatrics training, I trained in pediatrics at a very socially engaged program at the Social Pediatrics program at Montefiore, where I found many like-minded people who were engaged in the work of medicine as kind of social justice work. Post that training, I was a fellow at Columbia, ended up knocking at my now colleague Rita Sharon's door saying, "Hey, I've heard of this thing called narrative medicine. I'm not really sure what it is." Let me correct myself there. I probably thought I'm not really sure what it is. I'm not sure I articulated that to her at that time. But I became involved around 2001 in an early grant that she had, where she brought together some of us to really think through what narrative medicine training might look like at the medical center. A number of years later, some of those colleagues and I founded the master's program in narrative medicine, which sits at the undergraduate campus. So it sits at the Morningside campus, which is, for those of you who don't know New York, in a slightly different place than the medical campus. And I have been full-time there since about 2015. I cut back on my clinical work as a pediatrician. I ended up teaching not only just in the narrative medicine program, but in two undergraduate centers, the Center for Ethnicity and Race and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, which happens to house the undergraduate medical humanities major at Columbia. And that's where I've been since then. But, I also have this other component of my career, which is I began publishing books for young people, middle grade novels, YA novels, beginning in 2018. And so when people kind of look at my career and they say, wait a minute, you're trained as a doctor, you're a classroom professor teaching kind of race and ethnicity studies in the context of health, and you're a children's author, how does that all fit together? And, I think the last thing I'll say in the context of this story is that to me, even if it doesn't make sense to other people looking at my career, to me, it all really stems from the same place. Because when I was in practice as a pediatrician, I was caring for kind of the corporeal health, right? The bodily health of the young people who came into my office. As a classroom professor, we are all, responsible for the intellectual and, in some senses, the emotional health of the young people in our classrooms. And as a novelist for young people, I really feel like the last component of that kind of bodily health, intellectual health, emotional health, connection making, the last component of that is that we as writers really delve into the realm of imaginative health, right? To be able to see oneself represented fully and richly and in nuanced ways in literature is a critical component of being able to imagine oneself living fully in the world. And I think particularly as a writer of color who writes stories that center BIPOC characters, I feel like that's my responsibility, is to write novels that are, in a sense, you know, places that young people can exercise their imaginative muscle in order to envision themselves in the world and envision better worlds for us all.
Thank you for that, Sayantani. It's just wonderful to hear the evolution of where you've arrived and also where you might be seeing yourself going. And I love hearing about how you find the time and also feel that it's critical to make space for all these components of who you are, and also how much it reflects this more holistic view of human existence where it's beyond just body, and how much story provides in terms of an ability for people to see a different possibility for themselves. And I'm curious if you wanted to speak more about some of your writing work. I'm sure many have followed, and of our listeners have heard a lot about your academic work and your clinical work. But if you wanted to speak more about that writing space and what it provides for you and what you hope that it provides also for some of your readers, and yeah, just going into that a little bit more here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I began writing. I've always written. I spoke about that early memoir. I spoke about some creative nonfiction that I've written. But I started writing for young people really because, as a parent myself, I saw my own children when they were becoming big readers encounter the same problems that I had experienced 30 years prior as a young person growing up in the States, which is, where are the stories that center me, Mama? They would ask. Where are the stories that center immigrant kids or kids of color or, kids from diverse backgrounds? And so I began writing for young people really as a family and a personal kind of exercise. Now, in retrospect, I recognize how much of that writing was really built on my understanding that health is something very broad based, right? Health is not just the absence of disease, it's the ability to live and not just survive, but thrive in our bodies, in our families, in our communities, and in the world. And so I reached back to my grandmother's stories, the stories that I had heard as a young girl visiting India on my long summer vacation holidays. And I often, tell it this way. I'll describe the fact that my grandmother would kind of gather me under the mosquito net, right in bed with her. And the overhead fan would be going and the mosquito net would be swaying gently around us. And she would tell me these fantastical folk tales of flying horses and princes and princesses and evil serpent kings and demons and whatnot. But in a sense, what she was doing was she was weaving these stories to remind me where I came from, right? To give language with which to imagine myself in the lineage of my ancestors, even as I moved forward into a very different world than she lived in, right? And so I ended up writing speculative fiction and fantasy novels. I have three different fantasy novel or three different series rather, from Scholastic, all based on these Bengali folk tales I heard from my grandma. But they're set in a diasporic present, right? And they're reaching towards a very, liberatory future, I would hope. So my first series is called The Kiran Mala and the Kingdom Beyond Stories. And in it, my modern day heroine, Kiran Mala, thinks she's just an ordinary Indian immigrant daughter from New Jersey, until it turns out that the fantastical stories her parents have always told her about her really being an intergalactic demon slaying princess are true. And she realizes that these stories that her family has been kind of regaling her with aren't just entertainment, right? These stories are her roadmap through her adventure. They're her roadmap, in a sense, to the stars. And the way that she will travel across the galaxies to this magical kingdom beyond 7 oceans and 13 rivers, where my stories take place. And in a sense, I wanted to play with that idea of, both immigrant stories and the tales that our ancestors kind of empower us with, and something that feels very futuristic, space travel. And so that's why that series is Bengali folktale and string theory based, because my notion was that, in string theory, it's this idea that there are multiple planes of existence all lined up next to each other, like guitar strings, and none of us know about the existence of the next, except, my theory is immigrant families, right? Because we traverse multiple worlds at the same time, right? We code switch. We know what it is to be speaking in one language, turn around, speak in another, go from one world, turn around, be in another. And so I kind of literalize that idea in the books such that these immigrant families, Kieran Mullis' family, they are galaxy hoppers, right? They're at the forefront of this kind of space exploration. And so Kieran Mullis has to travel across the galaxies, save herself, find out the truth of her own identity, and in that way really tap into her own superpowers. And one of the kind of key lines in that first book, The Serpent's Secret, that you mentioned, is that Kieran Mullis' father says to her, "We humans may not be magical or powerful, but the stories we tell our children can be." And so that's part of the reason I write for young people, right? We humans may not be magical or powerful, but the stories we tell our children can be.
Oh, it's such a fun little excerpt you gave there, just a bit of it. It's really wonderful to hear you speak of these memories with your grandmother and how that informed and also transformed into these, fantasy, but also touching on like bits of your history of lived history. And I'm wanting to, I'm torn. I partly I do actually want to get to asking you about, given that you were one of the individuals involved in formalizing narrative medicine and, actually offering it as a formal program. And I'm curious, as you now, that's over a decade ago almost that you started it, to see,
2 decades.
yeah, actually it's, oh, my math, 2 decades, oh my goodness. And just curious to hear where you feel it's situated now. And because I do hear in your history that you were influenced with a lot of critical health humanities in practice and what you experienced growing up. And so I think our listeners would be quite interested to hear of where you feel narrative medicine is situated now and moving into the future, in particular in the climate that we're finding ourselves with health professions training and a lot of the shifts we're experiencing in terms of practice. If you, yeah, just could say a few words around that.
Of course. I mean, the first thing I will say is that although at Columbia we call it narrative medicine, and there are other places that use that, particular combination of words, I actually really like health humanities as a broader term because I think it moves away from the kind of hegemony of doctors, right, and medicine, because it recognizes that that work of health and healing belongs to not just physicians, but nurses and therapists and social workers and family caregivers and community caregivers, and that there are all sorts of ways that health is built and protected and made sense of. So I really like the broadening of medicine to encompass health. And I also just want to recognize that there are narrative medicines or there are health humanities, right, in the plural. And so there are many institutions across North America and Europe and the world who are doing interrelated work. We may each have slight different nuance to it, but I think that all of this work and the both collaborative nature of it and its heterogeneity and the fact that we're each doing it slightly differently is important, right? And it's important not to feel like we need to trademark our way of doing it. That collaborative aspect to me is really important because even at my own institution and my own master's program, you ask, the 10 faculty members, who are involved, what narrative medicine is, we will each have a slightly different take on it. But mine is as follows. Mine is that narrative medicine is the clinical and scholarly discipline honoring the role of story in the healthcare encounter. And that if we human beings make sense of ourselves through narrative, through story, then it makes sense that at moments of trauma, change, interruption, illness, that we will need those stories, more than ever. And that both the creation of the story and the reception is something that is not magical, right? It can be taught for, particularly the reception part. If we can train, somebody who's coming into an English program to closely attend to look at form and metaphor and diction in a novel, we should absolutely be able to train healthcare professionals with the similar skill set, right? And when I was in medical school, this sort of attention to story or the skill set needed to attend to narrative was treated as almost either magical or a happenstance. You had it or you didn't. And that's kind of ridiculous. We would never say, oh, this person, doesn't really have their anatomy or their pathology or their pharmacology, but we'll let them graduate anyway. Similarly, skill set in being able to understand, elicit, attend to, interpret, represent story is a critical aspect of being involved in healthcare, and we have to train for it. So that's, an important way that I define what's happening in narrative medicine. The other thing that I really, for me, as somebody who works at the intersection of narrative health and social justice. More specifically, I tend to work around issues of race and ethnicity studies. We have to, understand that narrative medicine must be both about the individual story, but also its structural and contextual stories around it, right? So the individual story within its structural, contextual, cultural, political contexts. And we have to teach for the ability to listen to both, right? And to elicit both. And so that for me has been why my career has ended up kind of at this interstices between the narrative medicine master's program and then undergraduate programs really very firmly situated in race and ethnicity studies and comp lit/medical humanities.
I'm curious, as I listen to you speak, you've mentioned, how critical this is as a skill set that we train our health professions learners as we move forward in this practice of what we call delivering healthcare. And I would love to hear from you what you might say to a colleague who is an educator within the program who says, well, we don't have time to devote to this. We need to ensure that they are safe practitioners, that um, the program is already packed with curriculum, and it's really difficult for us as a program to fit this in. So I'm wondering how you often field those comments.
I think that those comments were much more common when I began this work, I would say, in the early 2000s. You don't have the time for this, or that's very nice, but it's an extra. It will be tacked on as a extra activity at noon when everybody's overwhelmed anyway, or whatever it is. I hear that less now, I must say. Although, do I think that all the work we must do to integrate health humanities or narrative medicine fully and centrally into medical education, do I think we're there yet? I do not. But I don't hear as much pushback yet, because I think what people are recognizing in medical education is that safe, you mentioned the word safety. We need to have safe practitioners. Well, one way that we're going to have safe practitioners is to make sure that they're listening fully to what our patients are telling us, that they're listening fully to their colleagues, that they're understanding fully the cultural or political context in which, people are arriving, let's say, at the emergency room or the operating theater or in the clinic room. So I think that they're recognizing that good diagnostic practice, good treatment practice, long-term relationships, right, in the healthcare system, all of these are supported. Less testing, perhaps, right? So therefore, perhaps, more economical practice. All of this is supported by the sort of work that we're doing in the health humanities. And there's absolutely still that pushback, like, how am I supposed to do all of this work in 10 minutes or in 15 minutes that I have for a patient encounter? And I think my answer, to that's a very real thing. That's reality. We have 10 minutes or 15 minutes for a patient encounter. How am I supposed to fit all this in? And I have a kind of a 3-part answer. One is that we all know that if we have a skill set that's integrated into our clinical practice, then that is coming out in each and every moment, right? We're able to use those 10 minutes for the better, right? We're able to make more of those 10 minutes. So it's about kind of long-term, continuous, change in the clinician themselves, continuing medical education, if you will, right? It's also about, challenging. If you're frustrated at the 10 to 15 minutes that you're given a patient, well, maybe that's a structural problem. And maybe being involved in the health humanities, as I said, it's not just about the individual story, but it's about the structures around it. Maybe an important part of the health humanities is looking at that structure. Why do we only have 10 to 15 minutes? Is that appropriate, right? And then the third part is also the reason that we're thinking about healthcare as these 10 minutes that I have with the patient, and then that's it, never again, is because we've lost sight of the long-term relationships that healthcare is, in an ideal world, based upon. And what I think health humanities and narrative medicine does is it suggests that long-term relationship, where not everything gets solved in 10 minutes, but you show up for another and you show up for another and you show up for another. That's also, that longitudinal relationship is a really important part of healthcare. So I think all 3 of those components, you do it better in the time that you're given. Maybe you should be given more time anyway, and that's a structural and policy issue. And that healthcare is a long-term relationship. Those are the 3 ways I usually answer those challenges. And, one thing I didn't answer in your last question, you had asked 2 questions ago about kind of the current political climate and why health humanities is more necessary now than ever. Narrative medicine is more necessary now than ever. And certainly I can only speak to the US context, but with skyrocketing healthcare costs, with more and more people, facing challenges just getting food on the table, right? Seeking justice in their day-to-day lives, not being harassed by ICE and immigration patrol on the street, feeling comfortable that they will be approached humanely and justly by any set of authorities, right? Healthcare authorities, legal authorities, political authorities, etc. The work that health humanities does in centering a certain kind of approach to healthcare, which is holistic and which sees humans as more than just the sum of their diseases, which sees communities as also locations for health work. I think our work is more necessary now than ever. And so, the 2 things I'm kind of known for is a very one, set of theories that's apparently very inward looking, narrative humility, in which practitioners look inward at their own kind of frames of listening and biases, even as they're looking outward and listening, And then the other thing that I've been working on for the last number of years is this notion of abolition medicine. What is medicine's responsibility to structural violence, right? What is medicine's responsibility to broader abolitionist practice, be that in the prison system and the, prison industrial complex, in the medical industrial complex, in police, what have you. Both of those things, I think, are more necessary now than ever. Not to toot my own theoretical horn there for a sec.
Oh, not at all.
Not to say that I'm the only one doing that at all.
It is really great just to hear you grounded in where we find, or as you speak to what you're experiencing as a U.S. citizen at this time. And when I listen to what you just had to say, I think one of the things narrative practices and sitting within the health humanities really gives us, and for learners, is just to remind ourselves how much simply listening to a person is already an act of care, of opening ourselves to receive them. Whether we are able to fix whatever it is that they've come to us with, or whether we're going to struggle with it together, there is a lot about that. We do often say to colleagues, there's a lot of professional renewal that happens when you engage in these practices and reminding you of why you chose this path to begin with. So it's great to hear you actually put some very real life context in your response. And I'm wondering if there are things that you say to individuals that are starting to delve into this, in particular, learners that are coming, that are overwhelmed with what they have to learn in terms of the academic programs. And if there is some words that you often say to them, or give examples of as they start to dip their toes in terms of trying to balance out, how much time to reserve, because many, as you know, learners come in and they do have these creative practices. They are thinking of different things. And if you often have a piece of advice that you give to individuals as they are trying to delve and carve out a space, like you have for writing, a writing practice, for example, or some other creative practice.
My narrative medicine graduate students often come to me right before medical school. We have plenty of people as well who are mid-career professionals, or we have people not involved directly in healthcare, people who are journalists or memoirists or what have you. But many of my narrative medicine graduate students are people who have graduated, undergraduate, or in the process of applying to medical school in the US. And I often tell them that they're really in a lucky place where they can fortify themselves intellectually and creatively before they enter medical school, so that the artistic practice, maybe you're a ceramicist, that practice, your writing practice, your, painting practice, your theater practice, you can really fortify it prior to going in, because in so many ways, medical training, I have a son who's a first year medical student right now, as it happens. So much of medical training is really drinking from this fire hose of information. It's an enormous amount of information. And if your creative practice is already really shored up, it will both help you get through that, and it will be, I hope, a critical part of it, right? It won't be something separate, it'll be a part of it. So that's kind of one thing. And then I usually share a piece of advice that a dean in my own medical school gave me that I was enormously resentful to get at the time. Like, I hated this piece of advice, but now I pass it on with this caveat that, like, maybe you don't want to hear this. I too was super resentful when I heard this as a, young medical student. But I had this dean in my medical school who said, careers are long, ideally, right? Ideally, your life is long and your career is long, and it will have many twists and turns, some of which you plan, some of which just come upon you. Maybe you can't do everything at the same time, but you can do it over the course, right, of a career, as long as you have your eyes on the prize, whatever that means for you. And so for me, that was this broader sense of, medicine is a tool of social justice, right? That was what I went in with as a young person. Now, did it all exactly play out the way I thought when I was 22 years old or however old I was when I entered medicine? No, but because I had that, you know, light at the end, that I was always, that goal that I was always kind of orienting myself toward, all the decisions that I made in my career still kept that truism, right? That idea in front of me. And so I think if, trainees have that sense of what it is that their overall career should bend toward, right? I feel like the decision, even if the decisions aren't exactly the ones that they expected to have, they will keep turning toward, right, hopefully, that goal that brought them to medicine in the first place. And I truly believe, that most trainees are there for really beautiful, um, very human reasons, whether it's to be an accompaniment, as Paul Farmer says, with your fellow human being, right? Walk with them a while, whether it's to push human understanding, to ease suffering, right? Cures for cancer, that's all about easing suffering, right? Whether it's about broader social justice, keeping those goals in mind, I hope, will hold these students in good stead. And then the other thing I often talk about is community among practitioners, but also community betwixt types of practitioners. You don't have to do everything alone. I know the old myth is the buck always stops with the physician. There's an enormously rich and intelligent and skilled team, nurses, social workers, family members, all around you who you can lean upon and learn from. And every medical student knows, right, that you learn as much, if not more, from that OR nurse or that tech or, that social worker on the floor as you do from a physician. So community.
Yeah. I would have to agree with you that I find a lot of the work in narrative medicine and the health humanities are really collaborative ways of thinking and being because it is rooted in story and in honoring stories and listening to stories and thinking about intersections. There's so much about it that's about the intersectionality of everyday existence. So it's wonderful to hear you also again talk about that I think when we're all, especially in our younger ages, we aren't able to have the perspective to know that it's going to be up and down in a struggle, but the struggle is part of the process. And it's great just to I think some of my artistic colleagues also remind me that even being in this clinical space is research in some ways for your creative practice. And if you can frame it in that way and just see the kind of information mining or the creative idea mining that comes from where you hop from different spaces and just the complexity of who we are as people. Uh, I know that our listeners often like hearing from our guests what book you might have recently read or play you might have seen or artwork that has just stayed with you for some reason and to tell us why.
So a big part of my own creative practice is making sure that I am filling up my well with all sorts of creative work. So I happen to be lucky enough to live near New York City. And so I recently went to see the wonderful Ruth Ozawa retrospective at the MoMA, at the Museum of Modern Art, and was absolutely blown away by this artist whose, fiber work, sculptures, both hearken, some of that work is done with metal, hearken to the fact that she was interned in a Japanese internment camp. And although she never really spoke openly of those connections to her work, I could see them. So much of her work is about the interplay of shadow and light, what's there and what's not there. And of course, she was she was a parent. I think she had 6 children. And she was really dedicated to the idea of arts education and arts in community. And so those were all lessons I kind of took from both Ruth Ozawa's art and just learning a bit more about her life. There's a beautiful theater scene in New York I recently saw, and I'm a big Jane Austen nerd, and so I saw Are the Bennett Girls Okay?, which was this really interesting modern adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, which I have also written an adaptation of. It's one of my favorite novels. I love returning to texts that I'm really familiar with, because when you return to a text that you're so familiar with and somebody who's adapting it is doing something innovative, you can kind of pay attention to that innovative thing. So I believe that the playwright wrote Mary Bennett as a trans woman and wrote the character for her own sister. I happened to see the understudy play Mary Bennett. The understudy was also a trans woman. That transness never was brought up. It was never talked about. It just was. Identity just is, like, it's just an aspect of who we are. It was such a beautiful and powerful part of that play and that adaptation and that centering of Mary. What am I reading right now? I always read many things at the same time. So in the car, I'm listening to a Sally Rooney novel. I'm listening to Intermezzo. At my bedside, I'm reading Megha Mojumdar's A Guardian and a Thief. This is a Bengali American author, somebody who grew up in Calcutta, lives here now. Absolutely beautiful. It's about like a 2 minutes into the future Calcutta, which is faced with climate catastrophe, and what happens when somebody who has her climate visa loses it, has it stolen. So that's, been wonderful. And then the last thing I'll say is that I am bad about integrating nonfiction outside of my work, because I do so much nonfiction, right, in my work. So I'm not great at just reading nonfiction. And this too, I'll say that I've had Karen Howe's, oh, my background is blurry. I've had Karen Howe's Empire of AI sitting at my bedside, but only when I just included it on a syllabus have I said, uh-oh, I'm going to have to read this book front to back now. I'm excerpting it. But it's really interesting. And I feel like, particularly for listeners to this podcast, what AI is doing in medicine, I think we have to closely examine. Because on the one hand, we are given these promises of kind of early detection of breast cancer. That's amazing. Of, other maybe, immune therapies, other kind of technological amazing progresses. But we also have to think about how to put appropriate guardrails, right, on that AI use in medicine. And I believe that part of that pushback might come from the health humanities and from narrative medicine. Efficiency is not always what we're going for, right? Flattening is a real danger in AI, whether it's an AI that's transcribing a story and kind of flattening cultural nuance and specificity that somebody's telling you, whether it's kind of an AI diagnostician who's drawing data from, spaces that maybe didn't include all of us, in the original studies. And, Karen Howe, who's a journalist who wrote this book, Empire of AI, Dreams and Nightmares, in Sam Altman's OpenAI, says the following, which I thought your listeners might be interested to hear. She says, "Over the years, I've found only one metaphor that encapsulates the nature of what these AI power players are: empires. During the long era of European colonialism, empires seized and extracted resources that were not their own and exploited the labor of the people they subjugated to mine, cultivate, and refine those resources for the empire's enrichment. They projected racist, dehumanizing ideas of their own superiority and modernity to justify and even entice the conquered into accepting the invasion of sovereignty, the theft, and the subjugation. And as somebody who's had all 12 of her novels and 10 or more academic articles fed, into large language learning models, in all transparency, I'm a part of a class action lawsuit with many other authors against Anthropic AI. It is, deeply troubling, not just that intellectual property copyright aspect of it, but the environmental devastation, the kind of labor exploitation in the global South, the ways that racism is baked into some of these computer algorithms. I really feel like it's time for us in the health humanities to have critical conversations about AI in general and AI in medicine in specific.
Wonderful. It's things that have been also actively being discussed in our own narrative medicine communities here, of just the role that the health humanities narrative medicine can play in grounding us and reminding us, and just to even just take a breath and slow down, perhaps, but that it can be a temporizing anchor into what we are being really just, it's all hurtling forward, and it is an opportunity and also a call to action, I feel, and as we stay within these communities, and because a lot of narrative medicine health humanities practices is just questioning and trying to maintain just that, like the sense of our humanity and the sense of humanity and in medicine and in our health practices. Thank you for sharing so much of your thoughts and your perspectives. It really was an honor to have you on the MBN Talks podcast. And I'd just like to close again by expressing our gratitude. And to our listeners again, you've heard me speaking with Dr. Sayantani DasGupta, and I'm Sarah Kim, the Health Humanities Theme Leads for Temerity Medicine at the University of Toronto.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this conversation, check out many other episodes. And if you're interested in learning more about narrative-based medicine, visit us online at narrativebasedmedicine.ca for more great content and to explore our upcoming offerings.